Rebellion, Chapter 14, 18. My lady, I have always been a loyal vassal dash. Lord Humphrey, your kinsman aided in treachery most foul. He brought mercenaries and Grafton men to siege me in the area itself, said Jane, tone like ice. Lord Humphrey flinched and glanced around the pavilion, looking for allies. He was seated opposite us with only a table as his defense. We'd arrived at Gulltown with Royce, Redfort and Waynwood troops ready for a siege. Lord Humphrey had called for a parley which Jane had been happy to grant. I'd made sure the soon-to-be ex-lord of Gulltown got a good look at Syrax and sea smoke before he'd been presented with bread and salt. Lady Rhea was seated to Jane's left, a sign that Royce and Aaron were united once more even if the personal rift between the two women would take far longer to heal. The fact that Rhea was looking at Lord Humphrey with a savage glee in her eyes and small smile playing about her lips was likely not all that reassuring. Sat to Jane's right, I kept my face neutral meeting his eyes with cool disinterest in the plea they conveyed. Finally, to Rhea's left sat Lord Dennis and Lord Gerald. Judging from Lord Humphrey's defeated look, he hadn't found reassurance in their corner either. My kinsman, my lady. I will hand over Sir Roland gladly for he is a traitor but I am not, he whined. And yet the mercenaries were brought in via Gulltown and Sir Roland raised an army from your lands. Do you claim to know nothing of this? Asked Jane. Lord Humphrey flushed, there was no good answer to that question. I understand I have failed you, my lady, but failure does not warrant this judgment, he replied after a moment or two. I heard Lord Dennis snort from his seat and Lord Gerald hush him quickly. Forgive me, Lord Humphrey, I fail to see how it does not. Your incompetence led an army of enemies into the Vale and men of your family raised another from your own lands. A lord who does not notice that is not fit to be a lord, Jane declared. Lord Humphrey glared at her before deciding to change tact, losing his sniveling demeanor. He straightened in his seat and his face became a sneer of anger. The lords of the Vale will not stand for this travesty of justice, he bellowed, rising to his feet. The lords of the Vale already approve, Lady Rhea all but sneered at him, gesturing to Lord Waynwood and Redfort. And what of you, my lords? What will you do when this deviant harlot comes for your lands? Asked Lord Humphrey, face now red with rage. Lord Gerald leapt to his feet, hand on his blade. Well, I suppose that answers whether the Vale lords knew about Jessamine. Why was it ignored? The Vale of Arryn was the most conservative kingdom bar none. Enough, barked Lord Dennis, pulling Lord Gerald back into his seat. We will have no problem with Lady Jane because we have no intention of betraying her. Meet me on the field, Lord Humphrey, and I will have blood for that insult, said Lord Gerald. Lord Humphrey snorted before turning to Laenor and I suppose I should not be surprised one woman who steals her family's birthright should be supported by another, he asked. Beside me, Laenor's hand came to rest on the sword he'd begun habitually carrying. Lady Arryn inherited the Eyrie in accordance with Undull customs. The preference for male heirs comes from the laws of the first men, I believe, such as the Shetts. Grafton flushed in rage at the reminder. And as for my situation, King Jaehaerys proved a king has the right to choose his heir when he chose Prince Baelon over Princess Rhaenys. If he had followed Undull custom, I'd be married to Prince Laenor and bowing to his mother. Laenor snickered at the thought as I watched as Grafton stood there, fists clenching uselessly as even in his anger he was unwilling to break guest right. I reject your terms of peaceful surrender. I name you a whore, a pretender who sullies the title she stole. You would have the whole Vale follow you into deviancy. I know what you are, Jane Arryn, you can take my city from my cold, dead hands. Don't worry, Lord Humphrey, I will, called Jane to his retreating back. After his men had finished filing out and we were left alone, Jane dropped her head into her hands and groaned. I suppose it was too much to hope he'd surrender peacefully, she asked. A great shame, said Lord Gerald, not sounding particularly upset. His eyes were still fixed on where Lord Humphrey had stood until moments ago, pale with rage. So, we must siege the city, said Laenor. He hadn't been keen on the idea, hoping Lord Grafton would see sense. Starving the Graftons out would be impossible, which meant taking the walls and street fighting. Our army wasn't big enough to throw away lives, so deploying the dragons was almost guaranteed, which meant Gulltown may well be reduced to cinders in the process. Not necessarily, Lady Rhea replied. Did you see the sigils on some of those guardsmen? Arryn men. They heard our demand that Grafton turn the city over to the Arryns of Gulltown and will relay it to their masters. Grafton knows this too, supplied Lord Dennis. Which means either the Arryns let us in or Lord Grafton has to somehow get the Arryns out, I said, seeing the logic. Did you plan for that? Lord Grafton likely thought he was threatening me by bringing the guards of my kinsman to confront me. Instead, he sealed the fate of his city, said Jane. Although I confess we did not plan for it. The original plan was to have your dragons burn the gates and pray to the seven. The fires did not spread too far and too fast. I'm just relieved I will not need to burn a city today, replied Laenor, and I nodded with him. Jane smiled and then frowned. My lords and ladies, could you leave me to discuss a personal matter with my cousin? They all filed out, Jessamine with a look of concern etched upon her face. I suppose you heard his parting insult to me, she asked, once we were alone. I did wonder how you were getting away with being so obvious, I replied, and Jane blushed. You do not care? She asked, surprise in her voice. Rhaenyra is not one to judge any man or woman based on who they love, said Laenor. I had heard rumors, began Jane, hesitantly. About Joffrey and I. They were true. Rhaenyra knew even before our marriage, Laenor told her before I could incriminate myself. Jane sat back and let out a sigh of relief. I did not wish to enter into our alliance proper without telling you, but it is a hard thing to bring up. As for being obvious, well, there's a degree of deniability in the Vale. It's not like elsewhere, as long as they do not see us actively engaging in such behavior they will not bring it up. I raised an eyebrow and she blushed again. That did not sound like Westeros, in fact, that sounded far too good to be true. I fear this business has me out of sorts if my tongue is failing me so, she said. If they bring it up with no proof, it is considered a mark against them that they were even thinking about something like that. Something no highborn man or woman would ever do even if it were possible. Since no one has any way of proving it unless I am caught in the act. It's not ideal for those of us who love that way in the Vale, but it's better than a lot of Westeros. You truly do not care. I confess my Vale lords will not speak of it, but Alicent will surely spread the rumors. It could damage the Black faction immeasurably. She was right, of course, but then if Alicent found out about a lot of things it would damage the Black faction. Laenor, for instance. Myself, for another. Even if the alliance with the Vale was not on the cards, I was not going to shame a woman who loved another woman. I do not mind. As long as your Vale lords support you, I replied. Jane smiled in relief and then surged forward, throwing her arms around my neck. Jess was right. You are something else entirely, she mumbled. I heard Laenor snort in amusement as she drew back. Have you put our notion of clan hunting to Lord Dennis and Lord Gerald? I asked, needing an excuse to move away from more awkward topics of conversation. Not to them yet, but I made mention of it to Lady Rhea. She says if we truly intend to go through with it, there are men who live in her lands who are better acquainted with the clans than strictly legal. She will give as many as possible to us as guides and trainers, Jane said, after a moment of studying me with pursed lips. She also pointed out that funding such a force would be a problem for the Vale lords alone, to say nothing of the upfront cost. House Valerion can provide loans to that effect, said Laenor, before I could reply. In return for a healthy amount of future profits, I imagine. Jane snorted. We can discuss that when we draw up the contract, Laenor replied diplomatically. Maybe I should make Laenor my master of coin. He seems to have a nose for making a profit. First, the timber from Lord Wendwater and now mines in the Vale. The rest of the day was filled with waiting. Lady Rhea was certain that if either the Graftons or Arryns were going to strike at one another it would be during the night. It seemed Rhea had taken her house's enmity with the Graftons seriously because she'd gone out of her way to have her spies produce a reasonably detailed picture of all the VIPs that resided in Gulltown. According to her, Terence Arryn was the type to strike in the evening as the guards were changing. Rhea also told us it was unlikely he would strike first. As high as honor, he followed his house words with almost religious fervor. If he swore to Lord Grafton, he'd follow him, even if betrayal would benefit him better. Still, all was not lost. He wasn't a stupid man, he always left himself wiggle room. If the Graftons made their move first it would be during the hour of ghosts, just before the sun rose, and it would be a show of overwhelming force to cow Gulltown into submission and quell any traitorous thoughts. Rhea thought this to be much more likely. Humphrey would be spoiling for a fight after his show in the pavilion earned him nothing but sneers in return, and he was not likely viewing Ser Arryn in a positive light right now. The day gave way to evening with no sign of any change within the city. I was tense, but Laenor insisted I try to rest. Night saw me curled up on an impossibly uncomfortable camp bed, shivering under a completely inadequate blanket. Somehow I fell asleep only to be shaken awake in the early hours by Laenor, informing me that smoke had been seen above Gulltown. I got dressed as quickly as possible with Velena's help and followed him out into the camp. As I made my way to the pavilion, I could just make out the smoke clouds that were beginning to rise over the city, although it was hard with the blackness of the sky. Around me the camp was coming to life as soldiers were shaken awake and preparing for battle. It seemed Rhea had an unrecorded gift for precognition. Has likely been preparing this since he knew we intended to hand Gulltown to him. I doubt we will need to go to his aid, he's a tricky one. Rhea was saying as I entered. I could fly over the city and have Syrax roar a bit to encourage Grafton men to remember where their loyalty lies. I suggested. Dennis hummed thoughtfully before glancing at Gerald. It could cause a panic which would hinder the Aaron men if they have a plan to take the city, he said after a moment of thought. Or incite the Grafton men to throw down their weapons if they believe the Aarons taking the city to be preferable to fighting a dragon, Laner pointed out from my side. We'll keep it back. For now our men will march towards the city and see if the Aarons open the gates, decided Lord Dennis. Butterflies stirred in my gut as I found Syrax, saddled and ready to fly. Around me, men flowed forward towards the city. From a small distance away, I heard sea smoke bellowing and Syrax shifted at the noise. She was as agitated as I was, sensing a fight coming. I climbed aboard her and made myself ready, a task made harder by her increased shifting and shuffling. After I was secure on her back, I calmed her with gentle brushes to the soft skin behind her horns and she went still as my fingers danced along the most vulnerable part of her body. It would never get old to me that dragons, the fire-breathing terrors of the sky, loved and adored head pats. The gates are open. Go. Go. Move into the city. The army surged forward and I could see that the gates were, indeed, open and displaying the Aaron sigil. Syrax tensed again at the sudden cries and shouts as the men ran forth, seeming more like a disorganized mob than a true army. Aaron. For the Vale. Iron Oaks. Iron Oaks. Strong as stone. Red Fort. Red Fort. Royce. 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 Syrax soared over the city, giving me a perfect view of the fall of Gulltown, despite the darkness. It had been Aaron men that had opened the gates. The main bulk of the army streamed through them, following Lord Redfort's banners, whilst some peeled off with the Waynwood banners. I noted Lord Dennis' men seemed to be heading for the keep the Graftons called home. Laner circled them with sea smoke before following the green and black soldiers. I followed Lord Redfort's men. Ahead of them, forming up by a set of defensive walls that split the docks from the city proper in what could have been a market square, the Grafton men gathered. They were forming into rows and using the narrow streets to their advantage. In order to reach them, Jane's army would have to march through a hail of arrows and then straight into spearmen. Flanking would not be possible. I watched as Lord Redfort began forming his men up, the heavily armored dismounted knights to the front. Able to survive the arrow fire, but the spears would be more difficult to navigate for them. He had archers of his own, but the Grafton commander had effectively taken them out of the game with his positioning whilst giving his own archers a killing field. I waited until the knights began moving through the alleyways and the Grafton's attention was taken up by them before urging Syrax into a shallow dive, pressing myself against her back. I heard screams as she trailed her massive claws through the Grafton men like she was so fond of doing when flying over the sea. I could hear the Grafton commander screaming for his men to form up and hold even as Syrax scattered them. Those that did not get out of her way died. Syrax pulled out of her dive and took me up, only to nearly collide with Laner, who was urging his own sea smoke on with some urgency if the crack of his whip was any indication. I could barely make him out on Seasmoke's back. I watched as he soared over the walls to sounds of dismay from the men on the other side of it. He pushed Seasmoke on and the circled back round. The ships, I realized, feeling like an idiot. There were ships in the bay and they didn't look like they were keen on staying in the city to watch the fighting. Instead of setting them alight, he turned Seasmoke's breath on the sea. I watched as it boiled and rose into a thick mist. Oh, that boy is a genius. I turned back to the Grafton men and the skirmish below me. They'd reorganized their formation, but I could see the bodies of their fallen comrades. Bodies Syrax and myself had caused. Bile rose in my throat and I just had the time to turn my head before I threw up. As if sensing my distress, Syrax gave a great bellowing roar, but I was barely paying attention. I'd killed people. I'd had Syrax tear them apart, left them bloody messes and smears on the cobble, and I'd killed them. I threw up again. I snapped out of my daze in time to see Lord Gerald's banners reach the Grafton men. My distraction had done its job. The spearmen no longer had the advantage of the alleyways and were forced to fall back into a semicircle, protecting the archers that fired volley after volley over their heads. Even though plate was damned near impossible to punch through with arrows, I could see the occasional knight fall to a lucky shot. Sweat prickled across my skin and I shuddered with sudden coldness. I could break those lines with ease. I retched again at the thought, but there was nothing left in my stomach to bring up. I pushed Syrax to begin her descent again, the yellow-green dragon bellowing her anger at my distress. The Grafton commander was yelling at his men, screaming for them to focus on the knights and not the dragon, but the lines broke as Syrax tore through them again. A few braver archers managed to snap shots off in my direction. I could hear the arrows whistle by, but none hit me. As Syrax pulled up again, the knights moved in and began the slaughter. Without the advantage of the terrain and the protection of formation, fighting the Grafton men were mere sport for the heavily armored and well-trained Vale knights. Within minutes those that were left began surrendering. I gave Syrax a light strike with the whip and she obediently began circling for a good landing spot. I must thank you, Princess Rhaenyra. I wasn't looking forward to breaking those Grafton lines. Just our luck to end up with the only competent Grafton facing us. Lord Gerald bellowed as I clambered down from Syrax. My legs felt like jelly, and if it hadn't been for him speeding forward catching me, I would have fallen on my face as my legs decided to go on strike. I'd landed in the plaza once his men had cleared most of those that had surrendered. The last of them were being hauled off by the Arryn and Redfort knights. The ground was still littered with the dead and sharp scent of blood had me retching again. First fight takes you the hardest. Deep breaths, he murmured, arm flung around my shoulder as if he were congratulating me on the victory and not the sole reason I was still on my feet. Bring the princess some wine. She's the only reason half you sorry lot are alive. I think she's earned it. A wineskin was pushed into my hands by a nervous-looking young man in Redfort livery. I drank and retched again at the cloying sweetness of it. Good lass, keep drinking. You did well, you kept going, you kept your head. His praise was spoken in a low voice so that his men could not hear. I did as he said. Smoke rose from the outskirts of Gulltown. I jumped as Lord Gerald's cloak fell about my shoulders and I realized I had been shivering. My boy is off chasing the last of the bastards. Your laner parked his dragon by the Gull Tower and the Shetts all but pissed themselves surrendering. Good thinking stopping the ships that way, got a good head on his shoulders that boy. More wine for the princess. The empty wineskin was taken away and replaced someone else's. I drank, teeth clattering against the wooden rim. Across the courtyard, Lord Dennis rode in with his knights. It took him no time at all to dismount and cross to us, his face bearing a fierce grin. The keep surrendered when they realized their lord was sitting in the harbor like a useless lump. Lady Arryn and Lady Royce are setting up there now. If you want to see dear Humphrey grovel, I'd suggest we head there now, he told us. Oh, I want to see that very much. Got your legs back yet, princess? I took a few experimental steps. Wobbly, but at least I didn't fall flat on my face. Lord Gerald clapped me on the back and shouted for horses. Don't worry too much about it, everyone's first kill takes them hard. It takes a man not in his right mind to enjoy killing, said Lord Dennis softly. Thank you, my lords. My voice was ragged and I suppressed a wince. I would need to see to that if I was going to speak to Lord Humphrey. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing anything he'd done caused me distress. We rode to the keep with a small escort of soldiers. Lord Gerald kept up an idle chatter for most of the way, something I was glad for. I had to sort through my thoughts. I had killed today. Actually killed. No, I couldn't think about it now. Now I had to be the heir to the Iron Throne. If I wanted to be queen, I had show everyone I was willing to fight to have it. Princess, is that your beast in the bay? Lord Dennis asked, interrupted Lord Gerald's stream of chatter. I followed his gaze to see Syrax floating on top of the water. I fought the urge to giggle at the sight. Yes, that's Syrax. She's fond of water. Can she fly out of water? Or does she climb out like a lizard lion? Asked Lord Gerald, seemingly out of genuine curiosity, but I wouldn't put it past him to be asking to take my mind off the fact I had key. No. It's more like a jump really. They dive and then push themselves out before flying normally. Syrax does it when she wants to catch fish. Dragons eat fish, came the surprised murmur of a knight I didn't know the name of. Lord Dennis shot him a look of warning. Dragons will eat anything they can half reduce to ash first. I've seen baby ones chew on charred plants and bushes, I said with a laugh. Yeah, that was a weird quirk I'd discovered. Dragons liked their food very well done, and it didn't matter what kind of food as long as they had the chance to set it on fire first. Brief dragon physiology lesson over, we made our way into the great hall of what had been the Grafton Keep. The extended Grafton family were seated against the wall, under the watchful eye of Jane's men. Jane herself had stolen what must have been Lord Humphrey's chair, and Lady Rhea flanked on her right, looking very much like the cat who'd gotten the cream. I took the seat to her left and returned the brief smile she shot me with a small one of my own. After everyone had taken their places, Jane made a gesture. A man in red fort colors stepped forward and bowed, respectfully. "The city is secured, my lady. We had minimal looting and some fires on the outskirts, but there is little actual damage," he told us. "That is excellent news indeed." "What of the prisoners?" she asked, eyeing the Graftons lined up in the hall. "Ser Laner prevented any ships from escaping the bay, so we have captured all the Graftons that were within the walls at the time of the siege. We making good time on processing the men who surrendered by the docks." "Good. Good. I will make sure your men are well rewarded for their heroics." The man bowed again, sensing the dismissal. After he'd left, another man was brought forward. I frowned. He was no peasant, but he was hardly dressed in a manner I would expect from a lord. He bowed low though, and in a clearly respectful manner. "My lady, I have come to beg you to reconsider granting Gulltown to your kinsmen here. They are no true nobles. They engage in trade, they shame their noble ancestors with copper counting." His voice was loud, almost a shout. From just beyond Jane, I heard Rhea sigh. I watched the man carefully. Was he a Shet? The same Shets that lost Gulltown to the Graftons after losing a war to the Royces? "We have the better claim on Gulltown, it was stolen from us by the perfidious Graftons. Yes, he was. I didn't hear you calling us perfidious when you swore to defend us against Lady Jane's unjust seizure of the city, you sniveling little man," barked a Grafton woman. One of the knights casually thumped her for speaking out, even as the man puffed up and opened his mouth to argue the point. "Enough!" Jane shouted. "Ser Eustace, I hear your petition, but my mind is made up on this front. House Shet has not the resources or expertise to hold Gulltown. Whether you like this or not, Gulltown is center of trade and the Vale needs a family that understands that trade. However, I will ensure that a suitable amount of land outside the city is placed under your purview for your loyalty to the Arryns." Ser Eustace bowed again, beaming. Oh. He hadn't really thought he'd get Gulltown. He wanted to see what he could get from Jane to strengthen his house, and in return, Jane gets to preemptively weaken a potentially troublesome vassal without breaking feudal contract. Gods, I felt like my mind was running at half speed to not spot that. Another man was brought forth, one I recognized this time. Lord Humphrey Grafton. His nose was broken and his doublet stained with blood, but other than that he was in good health. The look of pure hate he directed at Jane was, wow. "Lord Grafton. You incited rebellion in the Vale, you refused my lawful proclamations and then attempted to flee justice, leaving others to die in your place. For this, I would see you dead, but honor demands you have a choice. So, a black cloak or the headsman's block?" Lord Humphrey didn't speak for a while, his eyes flicking each of the lords and ladies sitting in judgment before finally he sagged in defeat. "A pox on you, I will take the black and hope I live to see you die screaming," he spat, furious. "Bastard! You shame us all." The same Grafton woman yelled as Humphrey was hauled from the room. The same knight went to thump her, but a raised hand and a command from Jane had them hauling her forward instead. "Maris, enough of this. Your lord father lost, there has to be consequences." Oh, they knew each other. I watched as Maris stared hard at Jane, who just seemed tired rather than incensed at the interruptions. "I will ensure you are taken care of, but the Graftons cannot remain in control of Gulltown. Mother's mercy, he brought an army in through its ports." Maris didn't have anything to say to that, so Jane had her steered away and out of the room. The Graftons were judged after that, and Jane pulled no punches. All over the age of 14 were offered death or the wall. Most chose the wall, but I was surprised to see some choose death. Many groveled for forgiveness, others stood defiant in the face of punishment, but regardless of how they acted, Jane remained determined, every inch the Lady of the Vale, through it all. Afterwards, a man who could only be Terence Arryn was shown forward. Cunning, let him see what happens to traitors before handing him the city. Also, seriously, Westeros genetics were weird because this guy is several branches removed from Jane in the family tree, but they could pass as cousins. Ser Terence Arryn. When I proclaimed the Grafton line attainted, you alone rallied to my banner. It was your heroic actions that saved Gulltown from destruction, declared Jane. Bullcrap, He waited for Grafton to betray him, then betrayed Grafton right back. I merely did my duty as your kinsman, replied Sir Terence, full of false modesty. A duty you performed admirably. It is my decision to raise you to Lord of Gulltown, do you accept? It would be my greatest honor to rule Gulltown in your name, Lady Arryn, he said, bowing once more. Around the room, Grafton faces glared at the man with hate. Then I do pronounce you Lord Terence Arryn of Gulltown. May your line rule fairly and justly from this moment until the end of time. Naturally, Lord Arryn's elevation warranted a feast. As a royal and cousin of the current ruler of the Vale, I was exempt from helping with the preparations, but it was pretty much a requirement that I stay to attend. My stay in the Vale had lasted much longer than I thought it would and had involved considerably more fighting and sieges than I'd been expecting. Word had gotten back to Viserys and he wanted me back in the capital. Awesome. That knowledge hung over my like the sword of Damocles. That he was angry with me was a given. The question was how angry and whether I could navigate my way into a chance to explain without Alicent present and muttering in his ear. To distract myself, I offered to play chauffeur to Lady Rhea, who had business in Runestone and had never ridden on a dragon before. Besides, Syrax could use the exercise. She'd done nothing but swim, fish and terrify the local populace, and I had no intention of creating the Syrax of the original timeline. Not that Syrax approved of my ongoing mission to prevent her from becoming the laziest dragon in existence. I think she would love the idea of having dinner delivered right to her face every day. As much as it pains me to admit now, I hadn't set out to acquire Syrax. I'd wanted Silverwing for the associations with good Queen Alysanne. I'd set off on the mountain that day with tips from the locals as to where she'd been seen last and sheer determination, only to run across Syrax a mile into my trek. She followed me across the Dragonmont making screeching noises the entire way. I never found Silverwing, and Syrax had been very insistent. And now? I wouldn't choose Silverwing even if I had the choice. I'd grown fond of my lazy, greedy lizard. It turned out that Rhea's business was going to take a couple of days. Her nephew had been left in charge of the castle and had sent several alarmed letters back regarding a dispute he'd been asked to settle in Rhea's absence. So I distracted myself with exploring Runestone. Or rather, seeing if I could solve the mystery of why the keep seemed to ignore the erosion of the cliff. Asking the staff yielded no useful answers, most simply told me it had always been like that and always would be. A few old-timers could remember a time when the cliff had been less eroded, but it didn't explain why the castle was ignoring it. Flummoxed, my next stop was Rhea's library. The Royces were an ancient house that could trace the ancestry back to the Bronze Kings in the Age of Heroes, and they had the records to prove it. Records that were religiously maintained in defiance of the passage of time. I must say, it's nice to see that you take an interest in history, Your Grace, Rhea's ancient maester told me as he retrieved several books he thought might pertain to the building of Runestone. Lady Royce is my aunt. I have been unforgivably rude in not learning her house's history, I replied. The maester nodded and continued sorting through the stacks. Ah, here it is. This book makes mention of several parts of the castle that no longer exist. According to Maester Hugh, they fell into the sea over 100 years ago. He handed me the book. The book went into some detail about upgrades and extensions a series of ambitious Bronze Kings had made to the keep after successfully conquering a portion of land that belonged to another king. A few years after the conquest there had been a great accident and the cliff had given way, plunging everything but the original keep into the seas below. Okay, that points to something odd going on here. Everything but the original keep fell? I asked. The maester nodded. Nobody investigated why. The cliffs are treacherous, Your Grace. Waves smash boats into the rocks and the current can pull even the strongest swimmers beneath the waves. They've no need to. Besides, fishing has always been poor here, he explained. He left me to my reading after that. Most of the books were more interested in the different kings that had occupied Runestone and what political pressures had led to their changing of the keep. Of all the different changes and alterations I was forced to return to one single fact. Anything that wasn't the original keep eventually fell prey to the waves below or the various winter storms that blew in from the sea. Well, that was wrong actually. There was apparently the overgrown remains of an entirely new keep one of the later Bronze Kings had raised somewhere to the west. It had fallen into disuse after his death when his nephew moved the court back to Runestone. So what was so special about Runestone? Why did the Royces, a house of kings, keep coming back to it again and again? It was a fine keep for lords but kings. I hit jackpot halfway through a book about the myths and legends of the Vale by some guy called Maester Ulf. Brandon the Builder. This guy certainly got around. He'd apparently built Winterfell, the Wall, Storm's End, and now this book claims he was also involved in the building of Runestone. The builder is said to have weaved spells into the foundations of Winterfell, perhaps he did so here. If so, perhaps I could see them if I took Syrax down. A quick check with the servant told me Rhea was still hip deep in the dispute her nephew had fouled up, so I gave the order for Syrax to be saddled and changed into my riding outfit. I didn't head straight to the cliffs. It was a beautiful day, so I let Syrax play amongst the clouds for a while, allowing myself to relax on her back as she chased any bird unfortunate to cross her path. Eventually, I nudged her towards the cliffs and the defiant spit of land that bore Runestone. Which was when Syrax began behaving very strangely. I could feel a change run through her body as she moved in closer. She was hanging back as if the cliffs were scaring her. I rubbed the back of her head and cooed reassuringly at her. It still took 5 minutes of darting back and forth before she summoned the nerve to take me closer, although I could tell she still wasn't happy. As I came in closer, I saw the slabs. Or at least, the bottom of them. The top halves were covered in dirt and soil from the overhang of the cliff. They were huge. How had everyone missed them? Then I realized. Ships avoided this stretch of the bay if they came here at all. They docked further east at a small town that fell under the Royce's purview, and nobody actually standing on the cliff could see them due to the overhang. That was no accident, surely. But the cliff had eroded slowly, so had the slabs been buried? Did they form a perfect ring around the keep? Syrax fought against me as I urged her closer, but I needed to see what the deal with those slabs were. No book had mentioned them, no servant had seen them as worth mentioning, surely someone had found them before. Oh, more evidence for Brandon being responsible for this. There was definitely some kind of runes etched on there, although with the way Syrax was avoiding the cliff face it made it hard to see. A few light strikes with the whip and I managed to get her to hold her position opposite one of the slabs, massive wings beating at a pace most would say impossible. Up close, they were even more awe-inspiring. Each as tall as a man and as broad as twice that, they were engraved with the ancient spiky runes of the first men. They'd definitely been buried, I could see the way their sheer weight had pushed through the rock over time. A shiver interrupted me and I wished I'd brought my cloak. It had seemed to so nice out earlier, so I hadn't thought to. Carefully, I unfastened myself from Syrax's saddle and gripped her horns, hauling myself closer to the runes. The slabs themselves were freezing. I could feel them through my glove as I ran my hand along the stones, tracing the etchings. Ice flowed through me, freezing me to the bone. First there was pain, such pain, and then blessed numbness. I felt as if I was drowning in the cold, my throat burning as I attempted to breath. Syrax gave a bellow of rage and dived, almost flinging me from her back. I somehow held on, more out of muscle memory than any real thought from myself. I could see my breath in the air despite the blazing sun above. We hit the water and I was thrown clear of my mount. The ice burned again and I screamed, even as felt water fill my lungs. And then just as soon as the cold had come, it left me. I broke the surface of the water and swam forwards, wrapping my arm around Syrax. She gave a bellow of something I almost thought was fear and then heat. Heat like standing next to Syrax's flames. I burned in it, cooking and boiling in my own skin. Trapped as it grew inside me until I was sure I would blister with the intensity of it. Its oppressiveness drove the air from my lungs, robbing me of my ability to scream. I wanted to cry, to yell, to beg whoever was listening to make it all stop. I drowned in the heat, in the blazing fire that rose within in me until it burned itself out finally, leaving me in the cinders. What do you mean you don't kn dash? Buy us some time dash. Broken at least dash. I opened my eyes. I was in a maester tower, I realized, brain fuzzily making connections. What had happened? My limbs felt as if someone had tied weights to them, my head felt as if it was filled with wool and my eyes burned and stung. I tried to push myself upright but found myself choking and coughing. Your Grace. You have awoken. I twisted my neck and grimaced at the ache it caused in my muscles and the brief feeling of nausea at the movement. What happened? I rasped as the maester gave rapid-fire orders to someone I couldn't quite see. We don't know, your dragon bore you back to the castle. You had a fever and were unconscious for several days. Days? What the hell happened? The feast? I asked, grimacing as my throat gave a throb of pain. It felt like someone had taken sandpaper to my throat. The maester pressed blessedly cool water to my lips and I drank greedily. Slow sips, your grace, you will make yourself sick otherwise. As for the feast, Lady Rhea sent word you were ill and Lady Jane insisted on delaying it until you recovered. I took slower sips and mulled that over. There was a clatter and the door flew open to reveal Rhea, lips pressed into a thin line of annoyance. She strode across the room and waited with folded arms as I finished the last of the water. What happened? According to the maester, you were perfectly fine when you mounted Syrax. That was the $1 million case, the slabs. I touched them. Vague memories of the bitter, biting cold that had come from nowhere and heat that had followed. How Syrax had dove into the sea, away from the slabs and their strange etchings. Now how to explain to Rhea her castle had assaulted me. I opened my mouth to speak but she cut me off. You are young. You think yourself invincible. Let me assure you though that you are not. The next time you feel ill, tell someone. A simple fever can kill if you ignore it, she barked. I sighed, that worked better than telling her about the slabs. I suppose that answered the questions I'd had about runestone though and whether Brandon the Builder had raised it. Magic. Magic created by one of the most legendary figures in Westerosi history, and it was in plain view of anyone brave enough to steer a boat up to the coast. What else was I missing? I apologize, Aunt Rhea. I also apologize for delaying the feast. I will fly you to Gulltown on Syrax first thing tomorrow, I promised. You most certainly will not. You will be getting in the wheelhouse and Syrax can fly herself. The maester said your fever was the worst he'd ever seen, riding Syrax will simply make things worse. I grimaced. I hated wheelhouses. Perhaps I could charm Rhea into letting me at least ride a horse to Gulltown. I was not able to convince Lady Rhea to allow me to ride a horse. The bronze tyrant kept me in the wheelhouse the entire way back to Gulltown, and even the brief trips outside had her standing not far away, ready to raise the alarm if something happened. In one way it was genuinely touching. I'd won myself an ally in Lady Royce when I told her the truth about Daemon, and I knew her overprotective manner was born from worry. She hadn't brought it up and neither had I, but we both knew that Targaryens didn't just catch a fever. We didn't get colds, sore throats or random aches like the rest of Westeros. It had been one of the cornerstones of Jaehaerys' doctrine of exceptionalism after all. Any time we got ill it was either deliberate or something so nasty that just catching it meant our lives were in danger. I knew she'd had her staff questioned, but I doubt she'd find anything. It was those slabs, the ones I was certain had something to do with the builder. I'd finally solved one mystery, but it had promptly given me another, greater one to muse on. It would have to take the back seat though. My time in the Vale was coming to an end and I needed to ensure I had the Vale Lord's loyalty. Rhaenyra. Have you recovered? Asked Jane, greeting us as I finally escaped the mobile prison Rhea had forced me into. Lord Terence was stood behind her, flanked by a younger version of himself that could only be Isambard Arryn. Hopefully he'd be a lot more sympathetic to Jane's will this time round with the memory of his family's raising in his mind. Well enough. I wanted to fly but I was strictly forbidden. As if on cue, Syrax plunged us briefly into shadow as she flew over the city towards the sea. I wondered if the harbor master was prepared to deal with navigating ships around a dragon. By the maester's orders, huffed Rhea from behind me. I was mildly impressed to see no tense reaction from Jane as Rhea bowed to her liege lady. Instead she managed a small but seemingly genuine smile. Lady Rhea's letter said a fever. I nodded as we made our way inside. Her kinsman fell in step with us. Forgive me, but Ser Laenor was of the opinion that the maester must be mistaken. It was all I could do to keep him in Gulltown and stop him from alerting every lord here that something was wrong. My husband is right, Targaryens rarely get ill and it is normally serious when it does occur. The maester said the fever was one of the worst he'd seen. It has passed though and I have recovered my strength. Let's leave the bit about poison out. I don't want to give Jane any more reasons to be snotty about Rhea, and implying she may have missed a poisoning attempt on the crown princess was pretty up there on things to get snotty about. Jane nodded and let the matter lie. It seemed the delay I'd accidentally caused had worked to Jane's advantage though. She'd apparently used it to put pressure on her lords to make their way to Gulltown, and within a day of my arrival they'd begun slowly trickling in. I was weary of them. They supported Jane nominally, but these were the lords that could not have cared less had Jane been replaced by Ser Arnold. Treachery by inaction was, unfortunately, not punishable in Westeros unless it was truly egregious. They were all quick to grovel forgiveness and profusely thank me for exposing Ser Arnold's lack of honor, and some of them even managed to make it seem halfway convincing. I'd barely gotten a chance to assure Laenor I was okay before Jane, with the most powerful political actors in the Vale present, called a meeting so that we could put the notion of my scouts to them and raise support for the first wide-scale proactive move against the clans in a generation. A bold plan, Your Grace, said Lord John Melcombe, after I'd finished outlining the bare bones of the plan. It does not matter if the plan is bold, it will fail as all notions of removing the clans have failed in the past, sneered Gon Corbray. Lord Gerald had been right. He wasn't willing to rise for a man who was already on his way to the wall, but he sure was bitter about the Graftons getting overthrown. He'd gone so far as to take as many of the displaced house under his protection as he could. A problem for the future. We've all fought the clans, true, and we've all hunted them and lost men for it. Yet no one has seen an effort on the scale in a long time, and that campaign saw the high road cleared for nigh on 50 years. The current Lord Linderley was ancient, but his voice held steel. And if we get enough of the mountains cleared, we can expand mining operations and dig in. We can push them back. Bless Lord Dennis. He'd lost a sister to the mountain clans and had taken it hard. He likely viewed the scouts as a vector for revenge. It required the entire Vale to be razed to clear the high road. We cannot afford such a campaign like that. Lord Corbray shouted. I was concerned to see it look like he had some support in that sentiment. Still, if that was the only objection he could come up with. Ser Laner and I have been discussing funding. With Arryn, Valerian and Targaryen funds we can keep a small, elite force fighting in the Vale for quite some time, the new Lord of Gulltown informed us all. So we can afford to waste the money. You have done nothing to convince me that this will work, that I will not just be sending men to their deaths in those 7 forsaken mountains. Lord Corbray, calm yourself. Jane commanded. The Lord threw himself back into his chair, eyes blazing with hate and looking very much like a child having a tantrum. Forgive me, I'm very much eager for a chance to expand my iron mines, but I am confused as to how this will work. From the way you've explained it, these will be Vale men under the permanent command of the Crown? I do not see the reason. Lord Belmore's tone was full of false confused politeness. He'd been one of those nodding along with Lord Corbray moments ago. The Vale as it stands is much weakened by the mountain clans. In raising a permanent force to fight them back, we strengthen the Vale immeasurably, but the simple matter is that the Vale cannot afford to do this. My cousin funds 2/3 of the unit, will only allow direct command of it to men of the Vale and will only deploy it outside the Vale in times of great strife, explained Jane. So in practice, we retain control over it at all times, it stays in the Vale unless Her Grace calls it to service, we pay considerably less than we would for a force of its size and nature, and we get all the benefits with little downsides. Rhea's voice cut in, voice as dry as the Dornish desert, as she spoke for the first time. Rhea and Jane's shaky alliance had put many Vale lords on the back foot, but it was still early days. Case in point, the venomous look Jane shot her for interrupting. And how does Her Grace benefit from the arrangement? Asked Lord Lucas, in the same tone of false confusion. A professional and experienced fighting force that will aid me if I call the banners of Westeros, I replied. I examined faces. Lord Gerald and Lord Dennis were ride or die at this point. Lord Terence would go along with anything Jane suggested, up to and probably including setting her up as God Queen of the Vale. Actually, out of all the lords present, only Lord Gawain seemed set against it. Even his nominal supporters Lord Godric Hunter and Lucas Belmore seemed cautiously interested. And the name for this fighting force? Asked Victor Linderley, gauging the room to be in favor. I have a suggestion, said Rhea, turning her gaze to her liege lady. The Falcons. Something told me Jane liked that idea, from the way she swelled with pride and damn near started preening. At that point, it was simply a matter of sorting out who would pay for what and whose sons would be given precedent for command. I left that to Jane, she knew her lords better than I. Surprisingly, she asked that I stay behind to discuss a matter of some importance with her as the lords filed out. It is an awkward request, she said finally. I poured myself a cup of juice and nodded for her to continue. That she seemed jumpy about whatever she was about to ask me had me worried. You understand, cousin, I do not wish to insult you with what I ask, but I would not ask if it were not important, she said. My mind was already running through the worst possible scenarios right now. Spit out, Jane, you're going to give me a heart attack. I need you to take an extra lady back with you. My sigh of relief was audible. Oh, thank God, at least she wasn't telling me she was actually marrying Aegon or something after all this. Of course I can take an extra lady back with me to King's Landing. Felena has already proved her weight in gold. I told her. Jane did not look reassured. Which of your ladies did you want me to take? Maris Grafton. My train of thought braked hard. The mouthy one from the hall after the siege. I asked. Mouthy? Odd way to describe her, but accurate, I suppose. Yes, that would be who I am referring to. Damn, I really needed to stop with the anachronisms. I understand her house is in disgrace currently, but... Oh, that unhappy look tells me you two have history. Are you using me to clear an old lover out of the veil in a way she can't protest at? I asked. Blunt, but I doubt Jane would be overly offended. We'd grown closer these past 2 months. I watched with delight as she went a vibrant red. Love, no. Not Maris. Not that I mean Jess is the dash. I waved my hand to cut her off as I snorted in laughter. She shut up and glared at me, but it lacked the bite she reserved for those she was truly angry at. Maris was one of my ladies when Lord Hubert was my regent. She was the only one who stood up to him. Mouthy even then. She said after my giggling had died down to nothing. Oh, now I got it. She was Jane's Rainey's. No matter what happened, however much of a bad idea it was to trust her, she couldn't forget what she'd done. Like Rainey's for me, Jane couldn't live with herself if she had a chance to return the favor and did not take it. I understand, Jane, more than you could guess. I'll take your first love back with me and you can tell her you've played the gallant knight in her defense. She went red again and I couldn't resist another parting shot. I thought the knight was supposed to protect the lady from the dragon though. That earned me a slap on the arm that sent it numb for a few minutes after. Not that I cared, I was too busy laughing at Jane's excellent tomato impression and stuttering insistence that it wasn't like that. Renera, shut up. With the last of the politicking out of the way, I tried to force myself to enjoy my remaining time in the Vale. I'd done everything I'd needed to do and more. Jane was mine, I'd gotten myself the first of my armies and started the process of strengthening the Vale. That Viserys was likely 5 minutes away from resurrecting the Black Dread and flying over to find me in sheer rage was a downside I wasn't looking forward to navigating. The moment the feast had ended and the lords began to go home, a pit of dread had opened in my stomach. I almost cried when Jane told me Lord Gerald would be coming back to King's Landing with us. She'd already promised to send a Vale delegation to court to at least balance out some of Alicent's influence, but I'd assumed they would be following on a few months behind as most lords were still only selecting which heirs and second sons they would send. News of the king's displeasure has reached us here, cousin. Lord Gerald knows your father, he knows what to say to mitigate his anger. Had been her explanation when I'd questioned her on it. I'd never been so glad for her decision to hide my illness than in that moment. It had been a risky move on her part, but had it gotten back to Viserys? I dread to think. I was still feeling sick with nerves when our much increased party boarded the ship that would bear us home to King's Landing. Will you miss the Vale, Lord Gerald? I asked, looking for any conversation topic to distract myself from the upcoming shit show. The docks of King's Landing were in sight and the travel back had been smooth sailing and we'd made good time. In fact, the only thing that had marred the trip back had been Maris Grafton's ongoing reaction to her new position in life. She hadn't taken Jane's command well and in the end I'd handed her over to Felena with a heartfelt apology. I reckon I will, but it's time my boy got some real experience running the Red Fort. He's a man grown now and I'm not going to live forever, he replied. Besides, it would have been me or Dennis and I know Dennis is looking forward to your Falcons too much to sit in King's Landing playing politics. I snorted without meaning to. Lord Dennis had barely waited until the feast was over to start sounding out who could send what men and where they could source the equipment needed from. You needn't be so worried, Your Grace, Viserys would be a fool to openly censure you for defending the rights of one of his paramount vassals, said Lord Gerald after a while, having picked up on my dread as the docks came closer. Not as reassuring as you wish it to be, Viserys is a fool, I muttered after a bitter laugh. But even if you're right, that just means his punishment will be private and tailored to fucking whatever plans he thinks I have in the works. Lord Gerald just snorted. If he was bothered by my blatant disrespect for Viserys, he didn't show it. Then again, Jane had asked him to come with me solely to make sure Viserys would know I had her support behind me, so she'd evidently briefed him on the matter and he had met the man before. For all that I hoped a private word with Viserys would resolve the matter, I knew that with 2 months to twist my actions to suit her agenda, Alicent had likely already denied me that route. I had little to no chance of convincing him that I was in the right before Alicent conned him into a very public dressing down. I was keen to avoid public humiliation and Lord Gerald was my insurance. If we were to divide the court up properly, it would be into 5 distinct factions. The blacks that look to me for leadership and the greens that look to Alicent's leadership are the obvious and most powerful. Whilst not the largest factions, even combined, our little war meant each of us had cultivated quite a little bit of political pull in one place because anyone who wished to actively involve themselves in politics had to have picked a side. Surprisingly, the actual largest of the factions were the Doves. They were the neutral lords, the Neds of the world, who would just like to pretend there wasn't a succession war brewing under their noses and stay at home with the wife and kids. I had always wondered how Viserys had ignored the foundations of the Dance of Dragons being laid right before his eyes, and the best I could come up with is blaming these guys. Their faction stretched from the southern reach to the northern vale, and they all, adamantly, did not want to have a war. Viserys probably assumed that as long as they existed, we would be prevented from truly fighting one another. Which made the War of Quills make a lot more sense now that I think about it. The next of the factions of note were the Warhawks. These were mostly minor lordlings, spares and low-born knights that wanted to fight and didn't care who they went up against. They wanted glory against an enemy, and they weren't picky about the enemy. They didn't often raise their voices in court as they were Daemon's biggest supporters outside of Corlys himself, but when they did bother to turn up it was normally with demands for war and sanctions, with Dorne or the Triarchy being their usual focus of attention. The smallest faction were the Seahorses, as I like to refer to them. They were mostly made up of stormlords that traded with Corlys heavily, supplying him the timber that the shipwrights in Hull consumed in vast amounts. Interestingly, they also included the last of Bormund Baratheon's lords that had supported Rhaenys at the Great Council. They mostly deferred to the Blacks, as putting me on the throne meant putting Laena's children on it in turn, but I wasn't foolish enough to assume it was me they were loyal to. This meant the Blacks, in theory, had 4 dragons, the Warhawks had 1 dragon, the Greens had the potential for 4 dragons, and the Doves had nothing. Which meant Viserys was forced to play politics to keep the Dove faction alive, because if war looked likely and they had no dragons for aid, they'd abandon him to whatever faction could seize control of the capital. If Viserys looked to be leaning towards giving into Green pressure, or I looked to be too risky to follow, the Doves would start jumping towards Alicent like rats off a sinking ship. If I began making significant inroads into the Green support or Aegon disgraced himself, I'd suddenly be hip deep in Dove lords that were suddenly very willing to uphold Viserys' wishes. That need to prevent the collapse of the Doves was what Lord Gerald and Jane were betting my standing in court on. Which meant they were also betting on Viserys pulling his head out of his behind long enough to see that. Is it too late to go back to the Eyrie? I was happy to see the small folk had turned out in droves to welcome me back. They lined the streets and cheered for the good Princess Rhaenyra and the brave Prince Laenor, which, I'm not going to deny, felt really good. Evidently Maria's nascent PR scheme was still going well. I'd have to find some sort of reward for her because this was beyond what I had been expecting from 3 months of work. The fact that Viserys had sent an escort to ensure we didn't get lost on our way to the throne room was less nice. Evidently, Alicent was taking no chances that I could wriggle out of punishment. Even worse was that Ser Criston Cole was leading it with a triumphant smile on his face, a nasty look in his eye and an awful lot of Green Knights backing him up. Princess Rhaenyra, I have been ordered to escort you to your father, he told me, as we dismounted the horses. I made a show of stretching, as if the words he had spoken were no great worry. You have our thanks, Ser Cole, Laenor replied with false cheer, earning himself a dirty look from the White Knight. I dispatched Felena and Maris to my rooms with orders to locate Maria and the Strong twins before taking an excruciatingly long time to organize the belongings we'd picked up in the Eyrie and to make sure Seasmoke and Syrax had actually flown to the dragon pit and not bunked off to go swimming. Commanding dragons was a bit hit and miss sometimes. As Crown Princess, I simply couldn't live with myself if something happened to Syrax. Or, more likely, Syrax happened to something. The fact I could almost hear Criston grinding his teeth at the delay had nothing to do with it. Viserys evidently hadn't appreciated the wait either because when we finally entered the throne room he looked livid. Alicent had outdone herself. I could only spot a few black lords amongst the overwhelming amount of doves and greens. My heart jumped when we passed the Valerian party and I caught Lena's eye. The tall girl was pale and very, very worried, and if even Lena could spot the incoming stitch-up. Daughter, you left so quickly for the Vale of Arryn, I fear you neglected to inform me of your departure. The king's tone was icy and Alicent had never looked more smug, so I elected to spring my trump card straight away instead of waiting and baiting Alicent even further. I waved Lord Gerald forward. Father, I beg your forgiveness, but I departed for the Vale to ride to my cousin's aid. Foul treachery would have seen her usurped and her own kinsman responsible. Although I was reasonably sure everyone would have known the circumstances of Ser Arnold's little rebellion by now, the throne room still exploded into shocked whispers and cries as the gossip sprang up. Viserys glared them all into silence before turning his eyes on Lord Gerald. The princess speaks truly, your grace. Ser Arnold Arryn laid siege to the Eyrie itself. I can scarcely contain the shame that it required the princess to expose his traitorous actions and not her loyal lords. Viserys' livid expression became a scowl of annoyance. He couldn't exactly yell at me when there was a Lord of the Vale telling him, without actually saying it, that Jane had my back. I was glad to note Alicent had realized that because she suddenly looked significantly less triumphant. Honestly, did she think I would just waltz in here without backup? Scratch that, she probably had. I hadn't exactly shown any particular head for politics before my marriage, and she had no way of knowing that it was me and not Corlys pulling the strings behind the black resurgence I'd been engineering at court before I'd flown off into a small war. Even though I had to admit I was surprised. Lord Gerald was essentially denying his and Lord Dennis' attempt at an intervention, one that proved I hadn't been needed in the Vale to rescue Jane, at the expense of his own honor. I can only praise both Princess Rhaenyra and Ser Lainer's actions in aiding us in rooting out the traitors and their collaborators. Ser Lainer personally led a band of knights that put the reforming Grafton army to flight and prevented Humphrey Grafton from fleeing justice at great personal risk. Princess Rhaenyra saved hundreds of lives in the siege of Gulltown by breaking the enemy formations with minimal loss of life. Truly, I do not exaggerate when I say the all of the Vale of Arryn are in their debt. More murmurs of surprise and a smattering of applause led by Lena, whose smile was reminiscent of Syrax spotting an easy meal. I had no idea she could look so predatory. Viserys still looked unhappy, but at least Alicent's expression now matched it as she realized that even if Viserys was against me, the lords she'd gathered for my supposed humiliation were not, and there were even some of her greens nodding along in approval at my actions. Is this so? Viserys asked, a decidedly unfriendly look in his eyes. Then I can only praise my daughter's swift actions in defending both the Lady of the Vale and the King's peace. Thank you, father, but I only did my duty as a Targaryen and heir to the Iron Throne, I replied, trying not to smirk as my parting shot at Alicent struck true. Oh, she definitely wants to strangle me now. I may have gotten out of punishment in public, but given the fact Viserys' anger still had not abated by the time I left for my rooms, I was still going to get it in the neck in private. Still, my success in the Vale had inspired me to properly plan out a procession through Westeros. Of course, no one else had a succession war to interfere with right now, but it never hurt to make it personal by showing up at their house with a fire-breathing dragon. Planning that was abruptly ended when Viserys stormed into my rooms and put my ladies to flight. Even Lena and Laenor had been sent away like small children so that Viserys could have a private word with his daughter. He hadn't bought Kristen, at least. This conversation would be going very differently if he bought Kristen. I can scarcely put into words how disappointed I am in you, Rhaenyra, he told me, after he'd tried and failed to stare me out. I settled for rubbing the pain from my fingers and fixing him with my patented neutral court face. Anger flickered over his features and my own rose to match it. I swallowed it down. You come to court and tell me you're refusing to fulfill the only duty I am asking of you currently. You gallivant around with the strong brothers, set my lords fighting amongst themselves, and then just as quickly you race off to the Vale, a place you had been told was suffering from the plague. His voice rose to a shout, but I refused to cower. Instead, I said nothing, very aware that my temper and his let loose always resulted in screaming matches. You start a war, raise an army on our doorstep and then come home as if you have done nothing wrong. What were you thinking, girl? At my silence he stood and slammed his hands down on the armrests of my chair. I couldn't help it, I flinched. He didn't notice, too lost in his anger. I make you my heir against the advice of all of my lords. I defend you against all those who believe you are not worthy to rule. And this is how you repay me. Say something, girl, you are not a mute. I defended my kin. I am defending my right to the throne. I replied, keeping my voice level. Viserys snorted in anger and threw himself back down in his chair. It creaked ominously at his weight colliding with it. Your right to the throne comes from me. I gave it to you and I can strip it from you just as easily. He wanted me to beg, wanted me on the back foot and worrying about whether he meant it. His violet eyes bored into mine and I refused to give him what he wanted even though I knew it would cost me. I would not let him derail everything I had worked for by constantly waving this threat in front of me. Strip me of my right to the throne now and you sign my execution order. 7 hells, Rhaenyra. Alicent is your family. Aegon is your family. Neither will kill you for the damned throne. Truly. Aegon is terrified of me. Alicent hates me. And we all know how that happened, don't we, father? His lips peeled back into a snarl. You and I both know where those rumors came from, Rhaenyra. I seem to recall similar ones regarding yourself, he said coldly and I saw red. Oh, without a doubt, except I never actually fucked him, unlike your whore of a whiff dash. My airflow was suddenly cut off as Viserys wrapped his hand around my throat. He let out a hoarse scream as I struggled for air, slapping weakly at his arm. He wrenched me to my feet and my back slammed painfully into the wall. Then his face cleared and he dropped me. My legs gave out and the floor rushed to meet me, my hands impacted the floor with a sting I barely felt as I gasped down precious air. He hooked his hands under my arms, trying to pull me to my feet. The door slammed open and Laurent Marbrand stepped in, sword drawn. Viserys looked up and shook his head. The white cloak nodded and stepped out. As if the king hadn't just choked out his daughter, as if nothing was wrong. I wanted to scream and throw something in. My throat burned and my hand ached. I pushed his help away and used the chair to pull myself to my feet, breathing still ragged. His shaking hand under my chin forced me to look at him. His face was pale, but I could tell he was still angry. Leave King's Landing. Go back to Dragonstone. Stay there. Be the heir instead of making a spectacle of yourself, said Viserys quietly. And if you ever cast such aspersions on Alicent again, you had better hope Daemon wants you on the stepstones because you certainly won't be wanted here. I left him there, sitting and looking at his hands as if he had only just noticed they existed. I rode to the dragon pit, mounted Syrax and made for Dragonstone. I should have told Laenor, I should have organized my ladies, I should have warned Lord Gerald, but I couldn't. I couldn't. I was numb and aching and scared. So I went home, the only place I felt safe. He would not take it from me. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.